journey.
Thank you to all the people I don't know, allowing us to keep playing these games and keep telling these stories.
Thank you so much for trusting me with this character that you've known for over 20 years.
I really loved playing Tormund.
You wanna fight?
This has been a life-changing experience being on this.
I never expected people to like Brienne of Tarth. I was totally prepared for people not to.
The fans have given me an identity that I didn't have.
There are far more fans of the show than we ever thought was possible.
It would be nothing if it weren't for all the rumours and theories and intense discussion going on and the Game of Thrones viewing parties.
Keeping it alive when we take a year and a half break.
But everything has an end, even Game of Thrones.
Welcome back to the channel, guys. And what a triumphant and brilliant end to Game of Thrones. So, we're in a divided camp here, severely. There are petitions that have went out that have reached over 1 million people that they just did not like this season. I was a little bit comforted to see some big YouTubers, channel reviewers today that did think that this last episode, the Iron Throne, was good. Because I was kind of getting a little bit afraid there. I was like, am I going to be on my own on this? But what I want to say is that I've read all the books of Song of Ice and Fire, and I understand the frustration with where this show has went and why people are disappointed. I completely get it because I've read the books. But here's the thing. This is how I would want to talk about that. I wrote I'm an amateur science fiction writer. I wrote a novel called Rebirth. And then I later said, well, it'll be easier to present this as kind of like vignettes and it's a little video, kind of like cartoon CGI type thing. And so I went that direction with it, but even with that, you got to direct voice acting. You've got to have the proper look for the show, for the movie or cinematic experience. And what I found when I was directing, when I was trying to adapt it from the novel and I was writing, and when I was directing these actors, that the actors, as they would come in and they would say their little lines and whatnot, everything we did after that point, every little instant, all the gestures, all of the way that the actors sounded, it started to change my novel drastically from something that wasn't that novel. And not necessarily that it changed to a bad thing, but it was different from that. It was, different from that novel so much that it would start to become its own thing, right? And I could see some of the novel left in it, but making changes to get it out, every action we took after that, it got further and further away from that novel. And this is something that happens when you try to adapt in some cases, and depending on how it's done. Of course, we got to see with Game of Thrones, the Dave and Dan's adaptation, that they start to combine characters. They would leave certain people out, like the whole Dorne story. There are many characters that got left out. The problem is once you start combining characters or leaving them out, it changes the whole dynamic, right? So I'm saying all this to say, that Game of Thrones, the television show, and A Song of Ice and Fire, these are two different things that are loosely based on one another, that I think a lot of people don't quite understand what happens as you have this butterfly effect of changing things. Even the smallest change can sometimes affect that work to a great degree. So that is the frustration, I think, that's what's coming over from the show watchers, right? And many of them, because many of them are book readers, right? And those books are really good. But I think where we have to go with this, though, and I'm looking at it from a totally non-biased position, right? And what I mean by that is I understand it's based on the books, A Song of Ice and Fire, but I've learned from my amateur experience with writing and directing. I've learned to understand that these things morph into their own things, right? And I'm sure when George R. Martin looks at the what he had in mind, the picture in his head of Game of Thrones when he was writing it back in the 90s and all that, I'm sure that what he sees in Game of Thrones television show, a lot of that stuff he sees is not his idea of what it was supposed to be, right? So I guess what I'm trying to say is when we look at Game of Thrones, if we weren't so much locking it and basing it on A Song of Ice and excuse me, A Song of Ice and Fire, we would think this was a fantastic show, right? It is only because of that to a great degree. Now, I know some people say, well, that's the whole point of watching it because it's connected to Song of Ice and Fire. Yes, it is the basis of that. But we also have to understand in the work of an artist, right? When George R. Martin kind of turned it over to Dave and Dan, I think there was an understanding there that this wasn't going to exactly be like A Song of Ice and Fire. And I guess we should be basing Game of Thrones on the merit of it being the Game of Thrones TV show. And when it doesn't follow the books exactly, that we don't hold that against it. Now, I know some people would say, well, no, it's not that. It's that they did these story arcs and they went nowhere, and things like that. But I kind of disagree with that. I think, again, even that we were pulling a lot from the books, right? Because we were interpreting what those story arcs meant based a great deal on those books in the, looking at the books and then trying to push them to the future. But I think that A Song of Ice and Fire had a great deal to do with that. But let's get into the episode, what was so great about it a little bit. I just want to kind of, lay that out there first to try to separate these things. But, I think one of the most powerful scenes in the beginning obviously was Peter Dinklage, Tyrion finding and Jaime and Cersei. That was just awesome, very heartfelt. It's like he was hoping that they had escaped, that he wouldn't find them, but he knew he would find them. It's something that just let him know they didn't get away, right? And I think he kind of always felt like they didn't make it, out of there. And I think for the most part, nobody really had a problem with that. I was listening to someone online, they was making a joke about they ran out of money for the budget and it was only so much rubble in one area. They never had Jaime and Cersei been standing a little bit to the left or right, that they would have been fine. They could have survived the collapse of the ceiling, right? Oh man. I thought that was hilarious to hear that. But very heartfelt, good performance again by Peter Dinklage. So the next issue I think is, of course, when John confronts Dany. Dany gives her speech. Well, let me roll it back before that, because we're getting a lot of complaints about Arya, right? Because they kind of set up this scene where Arya's walking along King's Landing's road and waiting for, it looks like, Dany to come out and give her victory speech, right? And it's kind of setting it up like the assassin Arya to might try to attempt to kill Daenerys or something like that. And so some people wanted Arya's character to do something with that. But the thing is, what we got was, it was already established with Arya and the Hound that Arya was going to leave that life alone, right? She wasn't going to be the assassin anymore. They had covered that already in the writing, that she made that change. So when she does meet up with Jon, it makes sense that she's just saying, well, your queen doesn't mind killing people, right? And that's pretty much it, because her going on to then start to hunt Daenerys, what means that she didn't listen to what the Hound said, Sandor, and that there wasn't a further movement away from that, had she have acted on that in some way. Speaking of somebody like Jon Snow, interesting enough, Jon Snow, a lot of people had a problem with Jon Snow's entire arc. He's been brought back from the dead. He didn't really do anything but just walk around and say she's my queen. What was the purpose of all of this? Well, I mean, how the show worked out. I mean, I think his getting brought back from the dead kind of makes sense, right? Because he, in a sense, was brought back to stop the last greatest threat that was left to the world, right? Because the White Walkers had been destroyed, Cersei had been destroyed, and it's kind of like that old concept of evil never goes away, or it just kind of morphs into something else in a way. And I don't even think Daenerys was evil, but let's just say that these type of threats that happen. So maybe we could look at it like Jon came back to stop the greatest threat that was left, and that was Daenerys, right? Maybe. So the next part was Daenerys. A lot of people, some people didn't feel it did much. That last encounter with her and Jon, how Jon gets close enough to kill Daenerys. Some people said that they didn't get a whole lot from it emotionally. I was, listening to some people speak about it online. They didn't think it delivered enough punch, but I actually thought it was great. I kind of seen it from a different standpoint. One thing I thought was excellent was that they kind of present Daenerys like she's mad in the last episode, like she just snapped and she becomes Ares, the Mad King, her father. But actually, I think my last video I did about it called it spot on when I said I don't think she was mad. I think she was just in a sociopathic tendency. And remember, a sociopath, they think they're doing the right thing. Whereas her father, Eris, was really mad. We can tell he was really mad, saying, burn them all, burn them all. This was real madness. With Daenerys, it wasn't, it didn't even seem like madness at all, right? When she encounters Jon in that final scene, and it was just very moving for me. I don't understand why people say they didn't get anything from it when she was saying that it is, they know what good is. And she said, what good is. And he was like, well, what about the other people who know what good is? And that was so powerful, wasn't it? And going back to Dany, how she was, after she was victorious, it wasn't like she was just crazy and mad and not, she was fulfilling her destiny about being victorious or losing focus or not eating or, going off somewhere to, sit and grovel. She was now focused on going out and freeing the rest of the world in her mind from tyranny and oppression. Now, a lot of people say, well, how does she justify it still doesn't make sense, because if she wasn't mad, because as I'm looking at it now, I don't think she was mad. I think she was just moving again into that sociopathic condition of this is the right thing to do, and I know better than everybody else. But that's a little bit different from being mad, though, right? And being like mentally ill mad, like what we got with the Mad King. This was just someone who was in a state of conviction about their beliefs about certain situations. And I know a lot of people say, well, how in the that's just atrocious for her to just turn so quickly like that. But if that scene was also so powerful because she explains how that happened. She explains that she says, well, Cersei was using the people against her as a weakness to keep things in this under her tyrannical control, right? Now, this is where it gets a little bit deep for me. And that is when we think about something like terrorism. Think about what happens in something like terrorism. They'll hold a bunch of hostages and then they'll do several things. They'll go take a bunch of hostages and they'll say, well, you guys pay us X amount of dollars, $1 billion, $1 trillion. We return the hostages. So they in fact want you to negotiate with them. And it's led many countries across the world to do that, to free their people, to keep them from being killed, right? And to me, I kind of see Daenerys, oddly and weirdly enough, in a very similar situation, because whether a nation makes a decision to pay to have people saved from terrorists, or they go, we can't start negotiating with terrorists because the demands are going to get worse and worse and worse. Each demand is going to increase, right? Because the terrorist is going to feel like, well, if all I got to do is hijack a bunch of people, 1,000 people, 10,000 people, whatever the case may be. If that's all I got to do, when we just go out and do that, and then we demand whatever we need, right? And it doesn't stop there. It goes from 10,000 to 100,000. But you get the point, right? It doesn't necessarily solve the problem. And I think that was Daenerys' argument, right? That Cersei using those people as a weakness, like she was doing. If that's how things were going to go down, then she had decided in her mind that she was going to approach that from another way. You go back in history to World War II, the droppings of the bombs on Nagasaki, Hiroshima, right? When people say Dany is mad, well, I mean, if Daenerys is mad in her reasoning that way, then so have many nations of the world, because remember what the reasoning is. It's at the end of it is still kind of the justification to it of the end. The fact that we got to kill countless numbers of children in a city to keep millions more from dying later, right? And that's the same argument Dany was giving there. She was giving that argument that, I got to destroy these people in this city because they were being held hostage. Now, I know a lot of people say, well, yeah, but they could have, what it was they could have been released and they would have went out. But see, at that point in time, I think it takes a much more broader set of circumstances where those people, it's kind of like the what happens, I think, in war again, where they strike, and let's say, for instance, a certain country goes in and liberate another nation. And the people in that nation, although they are civilians and they don't know what's going on, right? Their own country could be lying to them. They are still in a sense of, well, we believe what our country says, and these people coming in, and they are the bad guys, right? When maybe they aren't the bad guys, but either way, they don't know. And they're going to eventually rise up against the so-called liberators because they don't see them as liberators, right? So in a broader sense, I'm kind of going narrow with this picture of how Daenerys' mindset was working, because, as much as people want to try to present it like she had become mad and the Mad Queen, she still was, not an evil person in the sense of trying to go out and thinking she was doing evil, right? It's a difference. She was kind of just like came to this philosophy that it was justified what she was doing. Now, of course, again, those sociopathic tendencies, again, that's the problem with that. But I think that and specifically looking at it in reference to the writing in the show, I don't think that, it came off as just an abrupt, erratic turn, right? I think she was just, because I think she was just looking at it like, okay, well, now this is how we got to do things, because we're going to run into this. And then it would have happened maybe in the next city down the road, right? What would have happened if people did, and what if it just became this common thing, or that's what they did? So she was kind of looking at it, I think, on a layer like that. And just so moving how she was saying, what's good, what's right, but that's how it works. Everybody's good and somebody else is bad, right? And somebody's bad and somebody's good. And that's why I thought that was just so powerful. Going back to Tyrion real quick, because I kind of skipped over Tyrion. People were like, well, why didn't Dany just kill him when he... again, that's kind of alluding to she was just this mad person who just really snapped and went crazy and just rage, just unbridled rage. Where I found it different, I found out that it looked like to me after she won, she had really just, in other words, she didn't really pull a Cersei type situation. She was just kind of like, okay, we got this done, on to the next, set of business. And she wasn't, she wasn't just, I would say, just overloaded with anger and hate and all that. But I would say she didn't have Tyrion killed right away is because Tyrion's it was more closer to Dany than many other characters, right? And so he had spent a lot of time with her as her hand, and so him getting treatment a little bit different than like Varys got, how Varys was executed. I think that makes sense in the writing that Tyrion would be someone that she would not just make that move right there to just take, kill him right then and there. What else was interesting? Moving on to the Bran, I guess, right? That Bran, of course, Bran being the biggest problem with some in the show as he, as we well know, he becomes king, right? And if you didn't know, you've been spoiled on that. In fact, you've been spoiled all up until now. Listen to this, but so a lot of people say this is out of nowhere. This is crazy. This doesn't make any sense. But I don't know, because when we listen to what Bran says, when Tyrion's making this speech about Bran the Broken and why he should be king, Bran's like, well, why do you think I came all the way up here for? Like Bran kind of reminds me of the person who's at a ceremony or an award ceremony, and they're expecting to receive an award. That's why they came there. Like, it's of no surprise to them that they win, right? And so that's how Bran comes off in that, because of course Bran can see the past, present, and future. Now, some people say, well, it's inconsistent, because when Bran was down in Winterfell, and Tyrion was saying, you're the Lord of Winterfell now, he was saying, I'm not anything. I'm not a man. I'm not interested in that. So some people go back to that and say, well, that's inconsistent, bad writing. And so it would seem. However, we also have to think that, Bran, he's always in and out through his meditation and his green sight. And so for him to see different eventualities in the future, right before that event happened, that says that this is the best course of action to take futuristically, for him to be king, because it's going to maybe create the less problems in the future. I think that makes perfect sense, right? I was one of those people on the camp of, like, you take a show like Star Trek where they'll have something like Captain Kirk and Spock, and I'm like, well, Spock is your first officer, but Spock is not only more intelligent than you, he's in control of his emotions, he's stronger than you, he's, he should be captain. And so that's a similar thing with Bran. Bran, he would have the best temperament as a king, right? He won't go after his own whims and desires and put, the kingdom ahead of his. At least we don't think he would, unless he's something else. Well, I'll probably get into in another video about what the future could hold for Game of Thrones with characters like Bran, and maybe some of the prequels. He might pop up in some of them in a variety of things. But he is the best person to to be king and King of Westeros based on that. Another thing is, I think George R.R. Martin, like many writers, was inspired by Frank Herbert's Dune. And I've touched on this before, but Dune has a similar thing where this super being, actually rules, he starts to rule over these noble houses in this empire. And he has these abilities where he can see the future and do a variety of things. And, he's the emperor, the God Emperor, throughout this series, because and he sacrifices everything to be that for humanity, right? So I'm thinking that they went that direction with Bran. I thought that was fine. I thought that worked out pretty good. Is anybody I missed? Let's see. In the end, you get the small council. You get Tyrion. Oh, I guess Tyrion becoming hand of the king again. Right? There's a job he can't get away from. I think. I guess what they're saying is he's the smartest person in Westeros. Right? He's been, and if you think about it, he really kind of, he is the guy with the most experience. I mean, Tyrion has been a hand of the king to Joffrey's rule, right? He was hand, and then he was a hand of the king again to Daenerys' rule, and now he's had already been hand of the king twice, So this he's overqualified, he's definitely qualified. And then Bran ships, backs him and says, but you're who I want, even though he tries to get out of it. So that means that Bran has seen that Tyrion would be the best in that role. Jon Snow going back to the wall. I guess Grey Worm. I guess we can touch on Grey Worm. I think it was some problem people had with Grey Worm, the Unsullied being in Westeros after, because at this point in time, Grey Worm's made Master of War. He's in charge of everything now. And we're not really accustomed to seeing Grey Worm being control and power of it, and control of everything. But let's just kind of take a little step back. Maybe when Grey Worm finally, came to that situation where he was now in control of all the armies, the Dothraki and all of that, maybe he kind of had to shift now because he understood they needed leadership more more into a leadership like role. Whereas a lot of people said, well, he's unsullied. He just be killing all of Dany's enemies. And I kind of thought the same thing. But then I kind of thought back to when Grey Worm was in Marine after Dany disappeared, and it was like just Tyrion, and I think Jorah had wandered off too. So it was just like Tyrion, Dario, and it was Grey Worm. And at that point, Grey Worm was still the most trusted of Dany's advisors, right? Unless you can include Tyrion, but I mean Tyrion was still a Lannister and quite suspect of certain activities, I think, at that point. Dario was, I get, was the best, but I guess Dario wasn't really a ruler. And then Grey Worm, right? So maybe Grey Worm and with Missandei and all of them start to kind of pick up some rulership skills, and he didn't just go flip out and say, well, let me just, kill. And I got another theory about Grey Worm too. I think Grey Worm, we got to also recall at this point in time where he's holding Jon and Tyrion in King's Landing, all the other armed forces, the houses are outside the city, ready to attack. And of course, Grey Worm wouldn't care about dying. But I kind of see it too, like maybe Grey Worm kind of looked at it as a kind of like a life debt to Dany. He would follow her until her life was over. And once she died, I don't think it was any longer really Grey Worm's mission, right? If that makes sense. I think it would have been his mission as long as she stayed alive. But I think things changed because, Grey Worm's trying to really leave before. And see, that it kind of makes sense too if we think about, remember, Grey Worm and Missandei, they were going to leave and go back to North, right? So, and he was already kind of saying that, after she wins the Iron Throne, I'm done here, So, and he still goes to North, and they're going to be freeing slaves and a variety of things. But I guess it kind of made sense to me, with Grey Worm doing that. Also, had he fought and resisted, I think what would have happened with Grey Worm, they probably would have eventually took the city and killed them all. So it would have just been, them dying there in King's Landing at some point, and I guess he said, well, forget that. Somebody else was making jokes about how the Dothraki were walking around King's Landing and boarding the ships, and it's kind of strange because the Dothraki are usually like, they're just these wild men, and they just, they're all about honor and winning battles. And so for them to become so kind of domesticated in that sense, and they're going to get on that boat and ship on out, and not pillage the city and their loot and all that. Well, maybe they did still take a lot, whatever. Well, there's nothing left really. I guess everything was burnt down. So at the end, we get the small council meeting and a variety of those things. And I'm gonna say that was the comic relief of the Game of Thrones. I guess they were saying that the season was kind of funny. It was funny bits in it, but I guess you have to kind of throw that in. That their little comic relief. So I say, oh, that's the comic relief at the end. Although I didn't think it was very appropriate doing it like that in that small council thing. It's kind of funny how Bran comes in and he's like, well, I have to find Drogon myself. And we got to get used to saying long may he reign to Bran and saying it's going to get better. And it was kind of, it was comedy in that, right? And then they got Bronn up there as Master Coin. So a lot of people are like, this is getting ridiculous now. And I'm just gonna put that in the place of the comic relief, similar to what we got with how Euron died, killing Jaime Lannister, and I'm just gonna kind of leave it there with that. Jon Snow kind of comes full circle, right? He goes back, leaves the wall, or leaves the Night's Watch, right? And he's going out with the Wildlings into the real North now. So some people say he's going to become like the king beyond the wall, or another version of that. I'm kind of fine with that. Many of us know John wouldn't have made a good ruler. He wasn't really bred although he was a hero. I would kind of say he fulfilled his hero's journey. Because, I guess what they were going for was that Dany was going to become the worst kind of tyrant. And again, the worst kind of tyrant is the tyrant who really thinks they're on the side of the people, right? At least with Cersei was clear, like, I don't care about these people. The only people that matter is my family, the Lannisters and Jaime and one or two other people, right? Those kind of people, aren't the most dangerous of the tyrants or sociopaths. It's the people who tell that great story about why they're creating a better world for everybody. And they know they've got this God complex now. They understand and they know. And of course, Arya going, on to want to leave and just travel around, I guess. I don't fully understand why, she but she couldn't remain. I guess we could kind of say like what Arya was she didn't fit any of those roles anymore, right? She couldn't be a lady in Winterfell where Sansa was ruling. She just had to go. Yeah, and so I think that finished out well. Brienne finishing off, Jaime's the Kingsguard records, right? She finishes that off for him, and she becomes just like the Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, right? And I thought that was all. I thought that was all great. I like those things. But again, the hardest part I think for many of the stomach was the Bran thing, the Bran becoming king, and you have to go back and you have to look into great inspirational works again, like Dune, where they have these type characters that clearly become the characters that rule. With these special abilities they have. So I thought it was great run. I thought Dan and Dave knocked a home run out of it. It wasn't what we expected. Now, I'll throw this in real quick before I leave and get out of here. And it's something to think about, something to chew on a little bit, if you're just really, really up in arms about it. But we got to also understand that somebody like Dave and Dan, had a lot of respect for George R.R. Martin. A lot of people say they just abandoned to do the Star Wars thing, but I think they had enough time to do both. Even within this season, I think they could have shaped this up and polished this up enough to make it work. How they did it, right? I mean, if they wanted to tell the story that many of you all wanted them to tell, in its connection to A Song of Ice and Fire, this deep connection. It was pretty much a straight book to adaptation to television. pretty as close to the book as possible. I think that's accurate to say they wanted this to be as close to the book as possible. Whereas I don't think that's a good idea. I don't think that that was the idea for them to just copy A Song of Ice and Fire, the book, right? I don't think that was ever the plan. And I think George R. Martin understood that with David Dan. I think that's why he liked them so much as well. The idea that they were telling a different story just loosely based on his books. Now, here's the kind of funny part to it. Some people feel it was a setup either from George R. Martin to kind of set Dave and Dan up, thinking it would be this kind of, we have a lot of these book adaptations that turn dull and they don't do as good and they kind of fade away and the books are still better and they move on. So some people got this theory out that Dave and Dan weren't supposed to perform so great with this project, right? That the TV show wasn't supposed to be this big. Even when you hear a lot of the actors talk about it, and a lot of the early days of Game of Thrones, how they felt about it, a lot of them didn't think it was going to become this big successful thing, and they're right, because when Game of Thrones came out, I hadn't even read the books, right? It was only when I got through about the first season that I started reading the books. I hadn't heard of it until then, right? And a lot of people were in the same boat, so they didn't really know what this would be. It becomes the greatest television show on TV. And, now it's overshadowing George R. Martin books, because I was kind of worried about that myself. I'm like, is this going to be way better than the books? And, we're going to like the show better than the books. So you got that kind of theory going out. And then you got the theory where Dave and Dan, I won't say they sabotaged it, because I still think it was a great production. I think it was greatly done. Like I said, if we didn't have the reference of A Song of Ice and Fire books, we would have no problems with the foreshadowing of this or the story of this or anything. It's only in direct comparison to A Song of Ice and Fire and how true to that it is that we have this great, huge issue. But that could never happen on Game of Thrones, because even if we take something like the character of Quentin Martell in the books, right, who gets burnt by the dragon trying to embarrass and sell me still alive, a Marine, and all these things, this changes the whole. It's like it's a butterfly effect now through the show, because it either doesn't have a character or a story, or it has one who's fulfilling the role of another one. But this makes this never going to be able to follow the books like many of us would want, right? But the last part being that, okay, Dave and Dan intentionally try to make this thing totally different than how the book can end. So some people say they know how it ends, and some people say, well, they put George pushing in the books for George to become Bran to become king. Maybe Bran's still going to become king, because I think there's that big Dune inspiration that's lurking over what we're getting with Game of Thrones, right? But it could also be that it's a totally different ending, and they just, in paying respect and homage to George R. Martin, they didn't want to pale down the greatness of these books in any way. And that's how it is when you respect a writer to that degree, and you he's the better storyteller, and he hasn't got to the end of his books yet. You would kind of, in a respectful way, go, well, you might even intentionally. I could see myself being in a place like that, where I would almost intentionally, I tell a good story still, but it'd be my own story, and it wouldn't be George R. Martin's story, based on the books, but still my own story. And that always seemed to be the idea between George R. Martin and Dan and Dave. But that's all I got to say in this video, guys. Tell me what you think about it. How you felt about it. I completely understand, because like I said, I read all of A Song of Ice and Fire. Great books, right? Well, all the ones that have been completed up until now, right? Of course. So I get it. But I hope it also kind of sinks in some of, what I've said about these adaptions and about making something your own, and trying to understand that the creative property, that is owned now by HBO and these people, that, as much as we would like to be in control of that, many of us, that's just not how, things, work out, right? We have to let artists be free to make their own decision. No, this isn't like Burger King, have it your way, cause, go ahead, no, artists, good artists can't work like that. We can't just they can't just give you what you want when you want it because you think it's a good idea. If they did that, they wouldn't be great artists. But that's all I want to say in this video, guys. If you like content like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and until next time, take care.